Title of the sermon this morning is a question that gets asked. As a pastor, you get asked this a lot. Are we commanded to give 10%? And so even though that question will not be directly answered this morning, it will be indirectly answered. So let's read the text, open us in a word of prayer, and we'll jump into our sermon. Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. Here's what Mark writes. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion. For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought him one. And he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. Look down at verse 41 to 44. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on. If you will, pray with me. Father, I pray that as we examine 2 texts this morning that deal with the topic of money and giving, Lord, I know that this can often be a very sensitive, a touchy subject, that anytime we maybe feel our pocketbooks being threatened, that it can be touchy. And Lord, I pray that you would give us grace this morning, that you would help us to at least listen, Lord, even if we are not at a place ready to receive this. God, please at least give us ears to hear, to hear your word, to hear the words of Jesus and what he's teaching us this morning, what the Spirit is speaking through his words, and that we would at least position ourselves, God, to receive this, and that perhaps whether it's today or at a point later in life, that we would be able to apply it in whatever ways you call us to, God. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. This morning we get to 2 different passages, and I put them together because they thematically go together on the topic of money and giving and finances. We will look at the section in between in the coming weeks. We'll look at verses 18 to 40 in the coming weeks, but this morning we're going to just look at these 2 passages together thematically. I'm going to give an exposition of the text where I explain it verse by verse, and then I'll give application at the end of this. So let's jump into our text this morning in Mark 12, beginning in verse 13. Mark writes, They sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. So Mark begins our passage this morning with this vague they. He says, they sent to him. He doesn't tell us who they is. The last identifier that we were given was all the way back in chapter 11, verse 27, where it's the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. So I think we can assume this is the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. They send 2 groups of people. They send the Pharisees, some of the Pharisees, and they send some of the Herodians. Now, we've discussed this before, but just as a refresher, the Pharisees were the largest religious party at the time of Jesus. They were strict adherents to Old Testament laws and to numerous traditions. The Herodians, they appeared to be a Jewish party who supported Herod, but we don't know much else. There really is not much else out there as to who this group is. What's interesting is that these 2 groups are working together here. One commentator writes this: The Herodians were as obnoxious to the Pharisees on political grounds as the Sadducees were on theological grounds. Yet the two groups unite in their opposition to Jesus. Now, the purpose of their visit was not to learn about Jesus. They do not come to Jesus to learn from him. They come rather to trap him. That word trap there in the Greek, it's a hunting term or a fishing term. But in this context, Mark's using it figuratively to mean to catch off guard or to catch in a mistake. They're trying to come to Jesus to catch him off guard or to catch him slipping up in something that he says. Look at verse 14. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true, and you do not care about anyone's opinion. For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" So these two groups, the Pharisees and the Herodians, they come to Jesus and they use an age-old tactic, flattery. It's been going on for centuries, millenniums. They feed Jesus 4 lines of flattery. Number 1, "Teacher, we know that you are true," or "you are truthful. You are a man of integrity. You are sincere." Number 2, "You do not care about anyone's opinion." That literally reads, "It is not a concern to you about anyone." This means that you defer to no one. You do not seek anyone's favor. You aren't swayed by men. You do not care what anyone thinks. Number 3, you are not swayed by appearances. Literally, you do not look at people's faces, meaning you're not partial to any. You pay no attention to who men are. You show no partiality. And number 4, you truly teach the way of God. In other words, you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Now, we should pause and we should ask ourselves, are these statements true? And the answer is yes. Jesus is truthful and sincere. He isn't swayed by men. He shows no partiality, and he does teach the word of God in truth. These are all true statements about Jesus. However, I want you to consider the irony in their statements. They are insincerely calling Jesus sincere. They are falsely stating that we know you teach the truth. And they use flattery to a person that they testify is not swayed by flattery. All of this flattery that they give Jesus is simply to set up this question. They're all giving this to set up this question. And the question is this: is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Are we required to pay taxes or not? Now, why did they ask this question? Why did they ask this? Because they ask it because in their minds, it's a binary question. It's either yes or no. Right? They ask a yes or no question. They think Jesus will answer yes or no. If Jesus answers yes, you must pay taxes to Caesar, it will anger the Jews because they hated the Roman opposition. And they especially hated paying taxes to Rome. If he answers no, he will get in trouble with the Romans because taxes are required. So they think that they have effectively trapped Jesus. Either answer that he gives them will be wrong. Look at verses 15 to 16. But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." And they brought one. And he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." So Jesus saw right through their hypocritical flattery and their flattering hypocrisy. And so he poses a question back to them. He says, "Why do you put me to the test?" The word for test there is peirazo. It can be translated test or tempt. But here it means test. These leaders are doing the very thing that Jesus told Satan not to do. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Jesus tells them, "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." Now, what is that? A denarius was a Roman coin. It was a coin that was used to pay a laborer a day's wages. Normally what would happen is you'd work all day, and then at the end of the day, you'd get a denarius, a day's wages. It was also the amount of the poll tax. They had to pay a poll tax, and that was the coin that was used, was a denarius. And so Jesus asked for one. And they brought him one. They brought to him one. And Jesus, as he looks at it, he asks them a question. He says, whose likeness and inscription is this? In other words, whose image is on this coin? And what name is inscribed on the coin? Another way you could think of it is, I have a quarter here, right? It's got the image of George Washington on it. And it says on here, United States of America. Well, what about a denarius? Whose image is on that? Whose inscription is on that? Well, they say Caesar's. Caesar's. Now, why does that matter? What is Jesus getting at here? Why does it matter whose image is on this and whose just inscription is on this? Look at verse 17. Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. Nobody trapped Jesus. Jesus responds not only beautifully, but also brilliantly. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, i.e., pay your taxes. Pay your taxes. You know what's interesting is that they probably had no problem doing business with Caesar's coins. And Jesus is perhaps suggesting, if you don't have a problem doing business with Caesar's coins, you should not have a problem paying taxes with Caesar's coins. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. Now, lest any of the Jews think that all of a sudden Jesus is a Roman sympathizer, Jesus indirectly makes it clear God supersedes Caesar. Render to Caesar things that are Caesar's. Render to God the things that are God's. God supersedes Caesar. And they marvel at him. Which is interesting here. Jesus didn't simply escape their trap. He disarmed their trap. We'll look at verses 18 to 40 in the coming weeks. Look down with me at verse 41. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. Now, perhaps later that day, we don't know if it's the same day or maybe the next day, but perhaps later that day, Jesus decides he's going to sit down in the temple. And he sits down in the temple opposite the treasury, right? So kind of like the treasury's over there, and he's looking at it. Now, the word for treasury here is the same Greek word as offering box. They're translated differently in English, but they're the same Greek word. What was the situation in the temple is that inside the temple at this time, there were 13 different receptacles in the form of trumpets. And presumably so that, you put the coin in, you couldn't like a trumpet would, you couldn't like reach your hand in and steal from it. There were 13 receptacles in the form of trumpets. And these receptacles, they were placed in the temple forecourt, probably in the court of women, used to collect free will offerings. So Jesus sits down opposite one of them. And he begins to watch people putting money into the offering box. And he notices something. The first thing he noticed that many rich put in large sums. Now, how does he know they put in large sums? Presumably because how loud the coins are when they hit the metal box, right? You got this metal box and a metal funnel, right? And they put in coins. It would sound loud. But up comes a poor widow. Remember, widows were some of the most defenseless in society. Not only is she a widow, but she is a poor widow. And she puts in 2 small copper coins, which the ESV says make a penny. Now, that's not necessarily a good translation. Your Bible probably has a footnote there. Literally, what she put in Greek, she put in 2 lepta, which make a quadrantes. A quadrantes was a Roman copper coin worth about 1/64th of a denarius, which was a day's wages for a laborer. But the reason they translated this is because these were the smallest and least valuable coins in circulation. What she put in was the smallest and least valuable coins in Roman circulation, which is why translators translate it as a penny, because our least smallest coin in circulation is a penny. Now, even if we try to adjust for inflation, you're like, well, our penny is worth a lot more than there. If we try to adjust for inflation, which is a fool's errand, if we take the average salary in America, if you take the average salary of one person in America, and then you take 1/64th of what one day's wages would be, we get about $2.50. So whether it's a penny or $2.50, either way, this is a very small amount. Look at verse 43 to 44. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on. Now, Jesus sees this contrast as an opportunity to teach his disciples, so he calls them to him. He tells the disciples, come to me, and he begins to teach them. And he tells them, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who were contributing into the offering box. Now, how can that be? Mark just wrote that many put in large sums of money. Many put in large sums of money, but she only put in a penny. Now, Jesus is not bad at math. So how can it be that she put in more than everybody else? Look at what he says. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty. In other words, the rich gave a lot because they have a lot. But she put in everything that she had. She put in all that she had to live on. Now let's put this in modern terms. Suppose a person puts $10,000 in the offering. $10,000, that's a lot of money. And suppose a person puts $2.50 into the offering. That's a small amount of money. And suppose we ask the question, who put in more? Now, to answer that question, it depends. If we are calculating based on sum, then the person who put in $10,000, right? We learn, I'm sure I could ask Brian this question. Brian, what is more, $10,000 or $2? $10,000. See, even Brian knows the answer to this. Very good, Brian. $10,000 is more than $2.50. But if we are calculating based on sacrifice, then we have to consider the net worth of the person. Suppose the net worth of the first person is $1 million. They put in 1% of their net worth. Suppose the net worth of the widow is $2.50. She put in 100% of her net worth. So even though $10,000 is significantly more than $2.50, 100% is significantly more than 1%. And we'll stop there with the exposition. Application of the text. I have 6 points of application. Number 1, be sober-minded, be watchful. The world prowls around seeking Christians they may devour. Be sober-minded, be watchful. The world prowls around seeking Christians they may devour. Peter writes in 1 Peter 5, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Now, what we see in the text this morning is that is not only true of the devil, that is also true of the world. The religious leaders, perhaps the Sanhedrin, sent some of the Pharisees, sent some of the Herodians for one purpose, one singular purpose, and that is to trap Jesus. These religious leaders are like lions lying in the thick grass, waiting to pounce once Jesus makes a mistake. This was not the first time they did this. They made a habit of doing this. Let me read a few passages to you. Matthew 16:1. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to test him. Matthew 19:3. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him. Matthew 22:35. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Luke 11:54. Lying in wait for him to catch him in something he might say. They were constantly trying to test Jesus and trap Jesus. And if that is true of Jesus, it will also be true of his followers. If it's true of Jesus, it'll be true of his followers. The world is always looking for reasons to say, see, Christians are hypocrites. I told you they're hypocrites. See, Christians do have double standards. They do have double standards. See, Christians do contradict themselves. Now let's be clear. These things will be said even if we live righteously and speak righteously, because they were said of Jesus. That was true of Jesus. It will also be true of us. But here's what's important. Let's not give the world any reason to devour Christianity. Let's not give them any reason to do this, to accuse Christians of being hypocrites or having double standards or being contradictory. I was preaching on Daniel a year ago, and I was really challenged that when remember the religious leaders, they said they wanted to trap Daniel. And so they went and they observed and they just kind of watched Daniel for a while, and they tried to seek a way to trap him so that he could get him in trouble. And what happened? They could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. They couldn't find any. They went to Daniel's house and they began digging for buried skeletons, but they couldn't find any. May that be true of all of our closets. We have no buried skeletons in our closet. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. The world prowls around seeking Christians they may devour. Number 2, flattery or even being flattered is a net for our feet. Be careful where you step. Flattery or even being flattered is a net for our feet. Be careful where you step. In Proverbs 29:5, the author writes this: a man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. Now, what's unclear in that passage is whose feet. If you flatter your neighbor, whose feet do you spread a net for? Is it your own feet or their feet? It's not clear. You could argue for either one, and I'm going to argue that both are true. As I mentioned in the exposition, that it is quite ironic that these religious leaders and these political leaders, they come to Jesus using flattery, but then state to him openly, we know that you're not swayed by flattery. It's quite ironic. They say to him, you are a sincere man. You are a man of integrity. You do not seek anyone's favor. You aren't swayed by men. You show no partiality, and you teach the truth. You ever wonder why Jesus was able to speak the truth so unashamedly, so unequivocally? Like, Jesus did not struggle with speaking the truth in any context. How did Jesus speak the truth so unashamedly, unequivocally? Here is one reason. He was immune from being flattered. He was immune from being flattered. John said that Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people, for he himself knew what was in man. John 2:24-25. You see, these religious leaders and these political leaders, they came to Jesus, they thought they could stroke his ego. They thought, like, let's go in, they maybe huddled. They say, all right, how are we going to do this, guys? Let's stroke his, they wouldn't say this, but let's stroke his ego And then in doing so, that will elicit the response that we want. Because they want him to give a wrong response. Why doesn't it work? Because Jesus has no ego to stroke. Jesus has no ego to stroke. See, I realize that, and these aren't true for all of you, but maybe one of them is true. I realize that if you are a people pleaser, if you are an affirmation junkie, if you are somebody who's easily flattered, or if you're someone who likes having their ego stroked, any of those can easily become a trap. Why? Because we will feel trapped into doing and saying what will make others pleased. You'll feel trapped. You'll feel trapped that you have to do or say what will make others pleased, or what will elicit the response that you want, rather than speaking the truth. Rather than speaking the truth. Flattery, or even being flattered, is a net for our feet. Be careful where you step. Number 3, pay to all what is owed to them, even taxes to Caesar. Pay to all what is owed to them, even taxes to Caesar. The religious leaders thought that they had sprung a successful trap. They thought that, we got them. We got them here with this question. What they failed to calculate was that they were not as wise or as intelligent as Jesus is. Interesting enough, it was actually Jesus who had previously trapped them. Remember when Jesus came to them and he said, let me ask you a question. Was John's baptism from heaven or from man? And they said, I don't know. We don't know. They think they have asked Jesus such a question. They think that they have worded their question in such a way that they have trapped Jesus. If he says yes, you must pay taxes to Caesar, he will certainly anger the Jews. He'll make them so angry that they will leave him. He'll lose his following. They'll think he's a Roman sympathizer and they'll leave him. If he says no, you must not pay taxes to Caesar, well, this will surely get back to Caesar, and then the full force of the Roman army will come down upon him. But they didn't trap Jesus. Jesus essentially teaches them what Paul will later teach in Romans 13:7. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Now, what does this practically mean? Well, if you owe somebody money, pay them. If you owe somebody money, pay them. If you are supposed to pay taxes, pay them. Even if you disagree with the tax, even if you don't like the government, even if you think this tax is evil, pay your taxes. If we are called to honor someone, honor them. Did you ever consider how radical this was for Jesus to say, pay taxes to Caesar? How radical this is? Why? These taxes paid to Rome. What does that tax revenue fund? Crucifixions. You ever think about that? Where did Rome get the money to pay for their crucifixions? In part from taxes. Jesus was commanding the disciples and the crowds to pay in part for his own crucifixion. Not only that, these taxes will also pay in part for the persecution of Christians for the coming decades and centuries. Rome will persecute Christians for the next 200 to 300 years, and that will be funded through their taxes. Now listen, I don't like paying taxes as much as the next person. I don't like paying taxes. Especially when the government uses these tax dollars to fund ungodly agendas, to fund abortions, to fund LGBTQ rights. I don't like paying taxes to fund those things. But we are called to pay what is owed to all, including taxes to Caesar. 4, just as coins bear Caesar's image, we bear God's image, and therefore we are commanded to give much more than 10%. Just as coins bear Caesar's image, we bear God's image, and therefore we are commanded to give much more than 10%. A common question in Christianity is this. You hear this all the time. Are Christians still commanded to tithe? Are Christians commanded to give 10%? Hear that question all the time. The difficulty with this question is that you can't answer it accurately and or thoroughly with a simple yes or no. You can't answer it accurately or thoroughly with a simple yes or no. The reason is that if we answer yes, if somebody were to ask me that and I just say yes, and then I move on, it can give the impression that Christians simply need to give their 10%, check that box, and then they have been obedient in their giving. Check, I'm obedient. If you answer no, it can give the impression that Christians can give whatever they want, even if it is nothing. One of the ways to answer this question is to look at what Jesus says to the religious leaders. He asks for a denarius. And then he asks the question, whose likeness and whose inscription is this? And of course, they answer Caesar's. Now, why did Jesus ask this question? Why did he ask it? Because whosever image the coin bears means it belongs to them. Caesar's coin belongs to Caesar. The coin bears the image of Caesar. Therefore, it belongs to Caesar. Now, Jesus also said, give to God what is God's. Well, what is God's? Everything is God's. Here's another way to look at it. Imagine if Jesus, instead of saying, bring me a denarius, imagine if he said, bring me a disciple. And he brings John, let's use John, and he says, here's John. Whose image does he bear? Whose likeness is this man? And of course, the answer is God's. In other words, Jesus' point is that just as the coin bears Caesar's image, we, all of us, bear God's image, which means we are commanded to give much more than 10%. We might say then, well, then how much, Pastor? Trying to get a pay raise? How much more? The answer to that is, if you're visiting, no. That's not, the answer to that is no. How much more? The answer lies down in verse 30. Look at verse 30. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and with all your finances. Now, I understand we might be asking, okay, that's all nice and all, but how do I translate that to dollars and cents? You want me to give everything? You want me to be the widow and give everything I got? No. How do I translate this to dollars and cents? I can't answer that for you objectively because the Bible doesn't say. I can give you my counsel, but it's not objective. The counsel I gave was back in 2021. We did a stewardship series on Friday night. This was the counsel that I gave in that series. Set up 3 tiers. Set up 3 tiers. Number 1, give to the local church. How much? 10% is a good starting point. If you want it to be less or more than that, that's up to you. But if you need a starting point, 10% is a good starting point. Number 1, give to the local church. Number 2, find a parachurch or a mission organization or something like that aligns with what you are passionate about and is gospel-centric in their vision. Give monthly to them or weekly or whatever, but give regularly to them, whatever God lays on your heart. $10 a month, $100 a month, whatever it is. Find an organization that aligns with what you are passionate about and give regularly to them. And number three, third tier, make regular, spontaneous, one-time offerings as the Lord leads. So you have a family member, you have someone going on a mission trip, someone who needs help, we're taking up a special Lottie Moon offering or whatever it is, make regular, spontaneous, one-time offerings as the Lord leads. That's the counsel I would give. Now, what percentage does that work out to be? I have no idea. Depends how much you give, depends how much you make. But be careful to think that it doesn't matter if I give nothing and it doesn't matter as long as I give my 10%, I'm good and done, get off my back. Just as coins bear Caesar's image, we bear God's image. We are commanded to give much more than just 10%. 5. Jesus is still sitting down and watching his people give to God's kingdom. Jesus is still sitting down and watching his people give to God's kingdom. I love the picture of verse 41. I love this picture. Look at it with me in verse 41. And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. I love this picture. Jesus, he's in the temple, he's teaching, and then he decides, you know what, I'm going to do a little bit of people watching. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do some people watching in the temple. And as he sits there, he notices two things. A, he notices the rich are putting in large sums of money. And B, he notices a poor widow who put in a negligible amount of money. I love this picture of Jesus just kind of sitting down, just casually watching the people deposit money. And I love the picture because the picture has not changed. Jesus is still sitting down on his throne in heaven, watching his people give money into the kingdom of God. You know, one of the difficulties of giving sometimes, and not the only one, but one of the difficulties of giving is this lingering question of, does this make a difference? Like, does this really matter? You know, if I give my $100 a month, like, does that really matter? Does that, you know, or if I'm a college student and I've got, you know, I get paid like pennies. Does it matter if I give my penny to the, does this really matter? You see, we can debate all day long about who to give to, when to give, where to give, how often to give, how much to give. We can debate about those all day long. There is one thing that is not open to debate, and it is this: God sees our giving. God sees it. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I know that some of you have family or friends, you've told me this before, some of you have family or friends who have told you, like, don't give to the church. That's a waste. Don't give to this mission organization. That's a waste. You need to save. Don't waste your money giving. Imagine if this widow had a brother or a son or a friend, right? She's got 2 copper coins left. And imagine she says, you know, hey, I'm leaving. Like, where are you going? I'm going to the temple to deposit my 2 copper coins. Imagine, you know, they might say to her, that's all you have to live on. Don't do that. And what good is that going to do? What is the temple going to do with those 2 coins? The temple may do nothing with it, but God will do something eternal with it. She will be rewarded in heaven eternally. Make no mistake, she will be rewarded in heaven, and so will you. So will you. Everyone will receive one final giving statement in heaven. And you don't just get a tax write-off. We receive an eternal reward. Jesus is still sitting down, watching his people give to God's kingdom. Number 6, last point. God measures not only the sum of our giving, but primarily the sacrifice of it. God measures not only the sum of our giving, but primarily the sacrifice of it. Is the point of this story to say that giving large sums of money is unimportant or insignificant? Is that the point? To say that it doesn't matter, like if you give a large, is that the point? No, that's not the point at all. Because every organization, Christian or not, recognizes that large donations are the bulk of giving. Every organization knows this. No church, no parachurch, no mission organization, no seminary can be sustained with copper coins. Right? They rely on the rich giving large sums. Let's be clear about that. So the point of this is not to say that the rich are useless and this doesn't matter. And that's not the point of what Jesus is saying here. The kingdom cannot be built off of small copper coins unless God decides to do it supernaturally. So what is Jesus' point? Jesus wants to teach them that in God's accounting books, if we were to open God's accounting books, his metric is not only the sum of our giving, but also the sacrifice of it. You're like, what does that mean? Let's put this in real, let's put teeth to this. Let's put this in real terms. Suppose a single mom who has 3 kids makes $40,000 a year. And she gives 10% of her salary. So she gives $4,000. Now suppose there's a double income married couple with no kids who combined make $400,000 a year. And they give 10%. So they give $40,000. Now who gave more? Who gave more? If we measure it based on sum, the married couple gave more. If we measure it based on percentage, they gave exactly the same. If we measure it based on sacrifice, the single mom gave more. Why? Because even though the percentage is the same, $4,000 to a single mom with 3 kids is a much greater sacrifice than $40,000 to a married couple with no kids making $400,000. Now, if you don't agree with that, we need to go to finance class. Here's the reality. This is the tricky part. The wealthier we are, the harder it is to give sacrificially. The wealthier we are, the harder it is to give sacrificially. Giving is a sacrifice to the Lord. And therefore, by definition, it should be a sacrifice. Let's pray.